Welcome to the Money Minus Shame podcast powered by the Financial Therapy Clinical Institute, where we make money human. Here, we eliminate shame from the financial experience and drive money conversations to be holistic and human first. I'm your host, Nate Astle, and welcome to Money Minus Shame. Welcome back to the Money Minus Shame podcast powered by the Financial Therapy Clinical Institute. Tyrone, we are talking something really interesting today. We're talking about intergenerational money stories. Is this a word you've heard before?
Yeah, I've heard it before, different ways, but I definitely am interested in learning more about it. So if you could just tell me what is intergenerational money stories, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, so we all have a story around money. And what I mean by that is we all have a history. We all grew up learning about money in a certain way. Maybe we heard our parents talk about money behind closed doors. Maybe we saw them fight about money. Maybe they were really intentional about sitting us down and talking about the importance of saving or spending. If we have memories around going to the grocery store, hearing things like, we can't afford that, or that's what rich people buy, all of this stuff impacts the way we perceive money. That is kind of our own story, but the truth is we are also part of a larger chain because the way that we grew up around money was impacted by the way our parents and our guardians, the people who raised us, grew up around money. And they were impacted by their parents. And so what happens is the messaging that we get around money, both from our family, but also culturally and from media and all that kind of stuff, it impacts us because how one generation experiences money impacts the way they raise the next generation. And so what happens is a lot of our personal experiences around money don't just come from our own experience. They're informed by previous generations' hurts and successes and all that kind of stuff. So it's being able to see the way you experience money as part of a bigger chain is a really important point of understanding how do we get out of our own shame? How do we see the feelings that we have and put them in context? I think that's the big word here is context. There's reasons why I feel the way I feel, and not all of them have to do with me. It has to do with things that didn't even happen to me directly. Does that make sense to you, Tyrone?
Yeah, it's making sense. And what I want to know more about is how does intergenerational money stories intertwine or factor into financial therapy? How does that work?
When we're working in financial therapy, we're, looking to change the way we think and feel and behave around money. A lot of times what comes up is, how was I raised around money? And we do a lot of exploring around childhood experiences. When people start to see the things that they don't like about the way they grew up, especially I have resentment towards mom or dad or whoever because of this experience, it's painful, and it's important that we're able to kind of process that pain and talk about that pain and talk about how they want something to be different. There's also a very important part of healing, though, where we learn to see what happened through a more compassionate lens. And it doesn't mean that everyone needs to forgive their parents or forgive past generations. That's kind of an individual decision. But learning to see that what I went through wasn't just because this person was a bad person, but it's because hurt people. And the way we grow up around money doesn't come from a ill-intentioned, past, but rather it's just part of a bigger chain of traumas or hurts or different life experience that informed the way that we grew up. It's a really important part of healing is when we learn to see the big picture behind our money experience. It's not just about us. It's not just about our experience. It's about past generations and how that informs us today, but also informs how we may impact the next generation. Because, like I said, we're all part of a chain.
When I've heard about intergenerational money stories, I typically hear people describing different races, different cultures, how that impacted with money, or maybe economical climate during the time. Is that what it is? Does that play a factor?
Certainly can. So I think what you're talking about is about intergenerational wealth, which is certainly part of the money story experience. If we were to look at some of the historical racist laws and things that impact people of color differently than white people, it's going to be impactful, not just with the money. People of color weren't able to get World War II GI funds the same way. They were pushed out of better homes and housing. All of these things impact how much money is able to be passed down from generation to generation. And that's kind of that generational wealth idea. The thing that was passed down from generation to generation wasn't just the money, it was the experiences. Because grandpa didn't have opportunities to build wealth, or great 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 grandpa grew up in slavery, how they talk to their kids about money, how they talk to their kids about financial institutions, it impacts everything. So the things that get passed down isn't just money, but it's the money emotions, it's the stories, it's the fears, and all of that stuff can impact how we view things. Quite honestly, this isn't just seen in different racial groups. It's people who grew up in the Great Depression. The way they talked and taught their kids about money or investments or things like that, it's also going to be impacted. People who grew up in the 50s or 60s, where there might have been more economic prosperity, have a different perspective on money than someone like me who grew up during 9/11 and the 2008 crash. My view or perspective around money is going to be different than past generations, but it's also informed by what past generations went through too. As you're hearing about this, is this something that you have your own stories or are thinking about your own intergenerational money story?
Yeah, I think about like one time I was a kid, and this was back when gas like $1.25. I remember just because I was called me his co-pilot. I used to be in the car with him, and I was pumping gas, and he sent me in the store in the gas station to pay for the gas. And he said, "You better make sure you get that receipt." And he was serious about it. And he said, "Don't come back without the receipt." And at the time, I was about 7 or 8, and I came back with the receipt. And he explained to me the reason why he gets receipts from the gas stations was because when he was a young man, he got beat and almost got arrested because somebody thought that he had stole something. So from that point on, he always got receipt as proof that he paid for it, because there was times when he was younger, he would pay for things and he would either get beat or, they get threatened with being thrown in jail for stealing when he didn't. And that was a big thing for him as a
Yeah.
child.
Yeah. I'm curious, did that end up changing anything for you in the way that you think about receipts or think about money? Like,
I would think about every time I went to the gas station for a long time, I would get a receipt. And this is even when I was paying with a credit card. I had proof on the credit card rate that I purchased it, but I would still get the receipt for a while. I just recently, probably a few years ago, stopped. But I just remember him in my mind, get the receipt, have proof, get the receipt. And it just something that stuck with me for a long time, that I guess like it was almost like he put some of that fear into me a little bit, seeing how serious he was about it, put a lot of that concern in me, and just having proof is something I purchased it.
yeah. Thank you for sharing. And I'm glad that you brought up fear because I think that's a really good point is I didn't just learn a financial practice of getting the receipt. I learned that I should be afraid, or at least grandpa's afraid. I should at least consider being afraid myself. And, that might not have been like a conscious thought for your 7 or 8 year old self, but it probably did impact the way that you felt around money or buying things. Like, okay, when I buy things, I got to make sure that I have proof because bad thing happened to grandpa and he's still serious about it. Maybe I should pay attention. One of my own stories, my mom is very much a saver. And I remember mom telling me all the time about saving. And I appreciate that on some level. I remember that being a positive experience when I got my first job. And I remember putting money in the bank. I worked at a car wash and a large portion of my income came from tips. So I remember going to the bank and depositing things into my savings account, and I felt really good. I learned later, though, that her parents grew up during the Great Depression, and they had a lot of food scarcity and a lot of feeling like there wasn't going to be enough. And so this kind of scarcity mindset or scarcity experience, which comes from a very real, valid place, impacted the way they taught my mom. And my mom had this fear drilled into her. Although that fear might not have come across as much to me, the financial practice did. I still view saving as this incredibly positive, happy experience, sometimes irrationally. Like I have a lot of pride or self-accomplishment when I look at my bank account getting bigger. And I don't want to like moralize any of these things as good or bad, but I do have to acknowledge past generations' experience impacts us. Whether we like it or not, it's just part of how we learn.
Bringing up banks just reminded me of like my grandmother hated banks because her parents had their money stolen by banks. So she didn't like banks to this day. My dad, for a long time, kept a lot of his money cash because they just had a huge fear of banks. I'm probably the person who brought the trend, generation that brought the trend, but there's just a huge fear of just putting money in banks. So I could definitely understand that how things change now. You see banks now as a place to maybe keep score or see that growth happening for you, which is nice. But yeah, it's interesting how those dynamics really shape us and we don't realize until later.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a pretty common one for people that grew up with negative banking experiences. Like a whole lot of banks closed down during the Depression. A whole lot of financial institutions had racist policies. And, there's so many things about past generations hurt that we feel. But even if we were to look at like our current generation, I grew up as a young millennial where it felt like a lot of the things that was supposed to keep me safe weren't gonna be around. Ever since I was little, I remember hearing things about how Social Security isn't gonna be there when you retire. I remember seeing 9/11 happen or the 2008 crash, and a whole lot of my friends and people at my school had to move because their houses were foreclosed on. And there's just kind of this general sense of lack of stability, which to this day, like, it's hard for me to want to invest. I've done a lot of working on this in my own therapy, but the impulse is still like, you can't trust the future. And if that's kind of where I'm sitting at with money, it's going to impact my financial decisions. Maybe it's going to impact me like hoarding cash, or it's going to be if money isn't guaranteed in the future, what's the point? I'll buy whatever I want right now. These might be extreme examples, but our stuff matters. It informs our financial decisions, it informs our emotions, and it's a big part of what we do in financial therapy. Is just let's deconstruct this money story a little bit. Let's acknowledge it for what it is, and let's see, is that something that I still want? Is this story still useful and important for me?
Yeah. When you talk about financial stability and being a millennial, I definitely can relate. When you're saying that, I just thought about a conversation with people from older generation, baby boomer generation, and they were like, you young people, you hop. You go to job. And I was like, by the time I came along in the workforce, the word pension was a thing of the past. It was like a mythical thing, so there's no more incentive to stay at a job. You're kind of like chasing that salary at this point because there's no incentive to really stay. But that financial stability, definitely as a millennial, I definitely feel that. Now, when you work with clients, does intergenerational money stories ever come to play with any particular clients that you work with? Do you have any examples to share?
I would say it comes into play with pretty much every client. One of the first
Wow.
things that I do with clients is have them create a money timeline. A money timeline is just an activity, and you can look at it at the Financial Therapy Clinical Institute website and download it there for free. But the money timeline is what it sounds like. It's a timeline where they write out some of their money experiences growing up. Anything that they remember, anything especially that has emotional weight. As I think about getting my first job, as I think about mom telling me we can't afford the Oreos, I still feel happy or sad or frustrated or disappointed or scared. Those kind of money memories have an impact on how we view things. But then we go in a step further and we ask them, what do you think your parents or your grandparents or past generations money timeline looks like? What do you know? Even if you don't know hardly anything or we didn't talk about money a whole lot, what do you know? What do you think it might have looked like? It's not just interesting, because I do think it's interesting for a lot of people. It's like, oh, this is where I came from. But I think it's really useful in understanding, why do I feel the way I feel? Why do I do the things that I do? Because it's usually pretty easy to tie my current financial behavior or my current emotional distress around money to, well, yeah, it makes sense. I mean, look at how I was raised. Look at how my parents were raised and experienced life. When we get to the point of that makes sense, I understand why, it becomes a lot easier to start making changes. Am I acting from my own wishes and values, or am I acting on an old pattern? Am I coming from my own place of self, or am I coming from autopilot from what past generations have taught me to do? It's pretty much everywhere, and that's what makes these fun. Is literally everybody has a money story. Everyone, all of us born had previous generations, and that impacts the way that we experience the world.
I know you say it affects everybody. Can you give us like a specific example or situation that you work with a client that had an intergenerational money story that you could share with us as an example?
Yeah, so I actually, right before this recording, had a client session where this client of mine had parents who did everything by themselves, DIY everything. And that kind of moralized the do it yourself game. Everything was about saving money. If I can do something myself and save a buck or 50 bucks, then it's worth it. What's worth it is saving the most money. And it really caused him a lot of anxiety now because he's in a very different financial situation. He's much better off financially than his parents ever were, at least how he viewed his parents. What it's left him with is a lot of anxiety around money. Even though he's well off and he can afford to buy clothes that he likes that are comfortable for him, he feels a lot of stress. And so being able to talk about his experience, being able to talk about why do you think your parents are the way that they are? And he was able to say, well, yeah, his mom grew up in poverty and his dad had an alcoholic father, and that led to lots of feelings of instability. Maybe they consumed certain types of media that was more alarmist or more scary. You start to see the whole story and you're like, oh, yeah, that's probably a very important reason why you feel the anxiety you do. And most people don't know that. They don't understand why do I feel the way I do. They just know that I'm struggling. But as soon as you start to see all the pieces in play, it becomes easier to understand, easier to process, and also easier to do something different.
Yeah, when you were talking about that, I was thinking about that, how it'd probably be difficult for someone to see that in themselves. I think we do things and we don't realize why we're doing them. Is there anything that people can do at home to try to maybe become more aware of it, to see if maybe they need help from someone?
Yeah, so I do think an easy activity is go to the Financial Therapy Clinical Institute's website. Go to the resource library. There's a worksheet and you can just download called the Money Timeline. I think starting by exploring your past is a good starting point. You don't have to have the reason right off the bat. Just start listing out memories. Maybe go by time period or just maybe go by which emotion are you feeling most around money. Like, I feel anxious when I think about money. When was the first time you remember feeling anxious around money? What was the most intense time that you felt anxious around money? Let's start looking for patterns and themes. And I think just writing it out can be a really good starting point. If you have the relationship with past generations, parents or guardians, whoever raised you, asking them can be helpful. Like, hey, I'm trying to figure out some more about myself or our family. I just want to know, what was life like growing up for you? Did you view yourself as rich or poor? Did you view yourself as having what you needed? Do you remember your parents talking around money? Do you remember conflict around money? Kind of just exploring the past is something I can do at home. One thing that you can do is learn to distinguish what is the behavior, the values that are my own, that I care about doing right, or what are the financial practices that are most important to me that I change, versus what is the reactions to past generations' hurts or traumas? What is my stuff versus what is the past stuff? If I can understand what I care about, what I value, then I can start to use that as kind of a guardrails around my behavior. My values are that I care about using my money for this and this. These things are the most important parts of my financial life. And this is why. This is why I care about those things. However, sometimes I feel anxiety, or I feel stress, or I feel anger, or I feel depression, or I avoid things because of past generation. I know what that is. Here's how I can distinguish the two, and here's how I can know, is this from me or is this from other people's stuff? Just even learning to separate out what's mine and what's theirs is a huge part of how we start to heal.
So let's say if someone is recognizing that now, would this be something that they would be able to talk to with their therapist or their mental health professional that they're working with, or should they seek out a financial therapist?
It definitely can be something that you do with an individual therapist. As we mentioned in other episodes, if you have the opportunity to work with a financial therapist, someone who has that kind of specialized training, it can be really useful. But honestly, a lot of what we're talking about is just generational traumas and how they get passed on. It's just money is something we don't think about as a generational trauma, but it certainly is. So you absolutely can talk about this with a mental health therapist. And like I said, even if you can't afford or aren't ready or aren't able to go to a therapist right now, there's a lot of really good free material out there on the internet. There's stuff on our website, even just searching like intergenerational money stories, you can find really good information. And there's a lot of things that you can do kind of for yourself and your own healing. We have covered quite a bit of stuff, and obviously there is so much to talk about when it comes to our money stories and what's going on with past generations, how it affects us today. I hope that there's at least some starting point of your own exploration into your money stories, because I think that's how we can reduce some of the shame that's built up around money, is feeling like this is just about me, but it's not. You're part of a past generation, and sometimes we just need a little bit of exploration to break some of those past cycles. We are excited to see you next time on the Money Minus Shame podcast, and hope that you will continue with us on your money healing journey. Thanks for listening to the Money Minus Shame podcast, powered by the Financial Therapy Clinical Institute. This podcast is not meant to be a substitute for mental health services or financial advice. This is a cafeteria where you can take what you like and leave the rest. Make sure to like and subscribe so you're the first to know when new episodes drop. And if you like what you hear, let us know. Reach out at money-shame@gmail.com or send us a DM with thoughts, questions, or topics you'd like to see us cover. Take care of yourself out there, and we'll see you next time.